Lenny Abrahamson was the original director and executive producer of Normal People. I'm Riley Chow of Gold Derby. Now, the show is adapted from the novel of the same name by Sally Rooney. So, can you tell me about the title? What does it mean to you, and why is it important?
I mean, it's kind of, you can look at it in various ways. I think in Sally's writing, not just in Normal People, but in her first novel, Conversations with Friends, often her characters spend a lot of time worrying about whether they are or aren't normal, whether they fit in, what would it be like to fit in, and whether their various kind of concerns or difficulties or obsessions mark them out as different or not. And it's something that she picks up in the generation that she describes, which is, people in their, I suppose, 20s, early 20s, that kind of constant assessment of self versus others. So that's one meaning of it. I think in the context of the show, it's probably also um, interesting that one of the things that perhaps marks us out from other shows is just a sense of that you're encountering kind of real people in a grounded world, and that the presentation is, at least to an extent, kind of low key. So it does feel like they're real people, not always normal. They're both quite extraordinary characters in many ways, but I suppose they are part of a real and recognizable world to the viewers.
Now, the show has been such a huge hit, and people are just in love with Paul Mescal and Daisy Edgar-Jones. Now, I understand that you cast Paul early and Daisy very late, but once you had them, how did you, in your role as director, really shape them into Connell and Marianne?
I mean, I think big part of what I like to do if I'm working with actors is, and particularly if they're younger actors, and for Paul, this was his first screen role. Daisy had done other things, but she'd never led a show. I think a big part of it is just creating an atmosphere of trust and comfort and creative kind of space where people can contribute. And I think if actors don't feel that they can really trust you and trust the process, then you won't get all of that lovely truthfulness and richness from them. So I like to spend time with actors after I cast them, and actually through the auditioning process, that's the beginning of their relationship. But as it goes on, I like to spend time not necessarily actively rehearsing, because I think you can over rehearse and do rehearse, but not a vast amount. Spending time with them, and then also just working towards a kind of naturalism, which is hard to define in a kind of mechanical way, but it's just a sensibility for the sort of performance that will fit into the piece tonally and into the overall kind of stylistic choices. So it's just doing small bits of work critically, looking at it together and feeling whether we as a group believe what we've just done, or do we feel that there's a way of making it more subtle and truer, and encouraging the actors to take their time and to allow space, and also I think encouraging them not to feel that they have to project, but to trust that the camera will find what it is that they're doing and will see what it is that they're feeling. You can't do that if you don't have brilliant actors, and you can't do it if you don't have, in the case of a love story, if you don't have real on-screen chemistry. Because I think if the chemistry is not there, the director and the writers have to start telling the audience, by the way, these people are crazy about each other. By the way, it's a grand love. But if it's really present, then you can take a different stance as a filmmaker, and you can really watch what's happening and encourage the actors to sort of sit into how they feel and sit into the characters that they've created, and trust that you'll be able to observe that if you're careful enough as a filmmaker.
So we've heard a lot about the casting of those two leads, but there is a third name that gets its own card in the credits, and that's Sarah Green as Lorraine. So I'm wondering how you
Mm.
cast her, and also if there were any other roles that were particularly challenging.
Sarah, the only challenge about Sarah was whether she would sort of, we would believe, people would believe that she was kind of sufficiently older than Paul. I mean,
Yeah.
Sarah is just the age at which she could have, if she had her child at the time that the novel suggests, that she would be correct. Paul was a little bit older though than that. He's a tiny bit older, a couple of years older than the character is described in the novel. But actually, um, the desire to cast Sarah was like, I just love her as an actress. I think she's absolutely brilliant. I've loved everything that she's done, and so it was like not an issue to sort of come up with her. Like it was a sort of dream to be able to have her. And what we did was we brought Sarah in to meet Paul, and we just stood them beside each other. And the way it is with really good actors, they just start to inhabit the body of the character. And Sarah, you could see her becoming, you know, that bit kind of closer to the sort of motherly presence that we need her to be. And she seemed to get sort of sit into herself in a way that a slightly older person might, and just photograph them together and felt pretty good, and knew that she would be believable. And she's so warm, and she's such a kind of good person, and that really is a like that's what filters through into Lorraine. You know, that sense of warmth and solidity and wisdom and kind of strength that she has. But I think there's some other parts that were just had to be got right, like Aisling Guckian, who plays Denise, who's Daisy, plays Daisy's mum. That's such a tricky role because in the novel she's very, you know, she's super cold, and she's very distant and almost cruel. And we wanted to see that, and we wanted to know that to her daughter, that's how she would appear, but also see something of the three-dimensional person behind that. And I thought Aisling brought amazing depth to that role. But there are great actors across the board, I think, in the supporting cast.
You mentioned that Paul's a few years older than Connell. That brings me to the one question I have about the nudity, which is
Yeah.
in the first couple episodes when the characters are, maybe 17 years old, was there any hesitation about having nudity for characters who are possibly underage?
I mean, I always thought that they were like, when people do their final exams in school here, they're 18. So like if you're in our fictional world, they are very plausibly 18. But also, I think working with actors who were in their 20s for me meant that the representation that we were making was an honorable one, you know, and that nobody was being sort of like, I thought you know, a kind of a thought through, a considered, and a very sort of well justified approach that we took. So no, I never felt any awkwardness about that. And I think the characters, the actors themselves are sort of, I mean, I think what we're trying to do is responsibly represent what actually occurs in the real world. And in that sense, I think we succeeded. You know, people at the end of their high school years are having sex. I mean, that's like true everywhere, I think. And the novel represents it very brilliantly and very sensitively. And we wanted to do the same thing. And I think the way we chose to do that, which was to work with actors slightly older, to work with an intimacy coordinator, to work in a very kind of inclusive way, it means that it's something that we could all stand over.
So we're coming up on the Emmys here, and I'm wondering if you know which of the 6 episodes that you directed you're submitting for consideration in Outstanding Directing, and why.
I think I think we selected episode 5, which is the episode the guys have, you know, they've left school, they split up when they left school, they meet again in episode 4, and in episode 5 the friendship develops and eventually blossoms back into a relationship. So I felt like 5 covers an awful lot of ground. Um, it's also it also probably contains my favorite scene in the show, which is the scene where Paul, as Connell, apologizes to Marianne for what he did in school, for how he treated her. And it's the closest, I think, to being tonally the way I felt the show should be, you know, when I read the book, like in terms of those first strong tonal and stylistic kind of impulses that you have when you're looking at material. That scene, because it's very still, it's very low key in a way, but I think it's incredibly intense, and it's very natural. And the choices that we made cinematographically in terms of how we shot it, choices even on the day in what we did to the dialogue and how we adjusted it to fit what was happening in the room, all of those things I felt came together in the way that doesn't always happen. And it goes from that kind of very serious scene to this beautiful and quite light flirtation that the two of them have at a party they go to um, later in the episode, and from that back home, and they sort of get together again. I was proud of everybody's work, and I feel like the episode is joyful, um, kind of complex and satisfying, and just in a way that I'm proud of.
Heidi MacDonald, she directed the other half of the series. I noticed that the episodes got a lot shorter as the series went on. Was there any reason behind that?
Not really. I mean, we had this lovely kind of open brief from the BBC and from Hulu, which was that when the BBC commissioned it initially, before we went to, brought it to Hulu as well, they said, look, you can make the episodes any length you want, or indeed different lengths. And so we always, some of my episodes are, one or two of them are quite long, so a lot of story to cover. Like there's one, I think, longest is about 34, 35, and most of mine are around 30. And it just seemed in those latter episodes, the material gets quite dark, and it felt like, I don't know, they seem to land best as very concentrated encounters with that phase of the story in each episode, and it just felt like that was the right length. There was never a sort of decision, that other than just what made sense for each episode, and that's how they landed.
Now, the show is a bit different in that it seems that you, as the director and executive producer, were kind of the main creative force behind the camera instead of a writer. So you actually got the book and you got the rights to it. And I'm wondering, when you were reading it, if there was anything that you thought right away, like this is something that's going to have to change for the screen just because it's a different medium.
Well, yeah, I think so. When myself and Ed Guiney, who's the producer at Element Pictures, and I work really closely with, we both loved it and took it to the BBC, and then Sally was involved in the adaptation. She was definitely in the creative engine room, as was Alice Birch and a few really key people in Element. But for me, sort of trying to galvanize everything, I think I was very aware the structure within the novel is quite like it jumps around in time. So Sally's taking you, and it's really interesting as a literary device. She'll sort of park a story and say, several weeks before he had said the following things, and it's really interesting as a literary device because it makes you concentrate. You think you're being brought on a very kind of curated tour of the key moments and interactions of this couple. But I think I had an instinct that we would probably end up with a more linear, unfolding, present tense kind of experience on screen, because that's what film does best. That's that immediacy, that like that kind of sense of encounter that you get when a camera looks at a face. It struck me then that probably that's where the most kind of work would unraveling the story as written and finding the right journey through it, as an unfolding piece of TV.
Now, we've seen the whole show, and you've said that, maybe down the line there could be a sequel. But I'm wondering, for you personally, are you rooting for these characters to kind of end up together in the long run, or do you feel that it was kind of more just the story's more about the impact that they had on each other at this
I
point in
mean,
their lives?
in a sense, I can step in and out of viewer mode and it back out into sort of maker mode. In a way, as a maker, I feel like it is what it is, and they're not real, and so like I root for the truthfulness of the story, and there is a completeness to it, and that's why Sally, I think, chose to end the story there, which was the significance of the relationship is what they have done for each other. And it's a very contemporary idea as well, that relationships shouldn't be judged by whether they, not the only successful relationships are not those which last until somebody dies. You can have a successful short-term relationship as well, or a successful messy ongoing one, like Conan and Marianne have. But yeah, like I do want, I mean, that's part of the pleasure of watching it, wanting them to resolve their differences. Like all love stories, it is that sort of elastic thing, and it's people are being pulled apart, and you can feel the tension, and you want it to come back. You want it to resolve, like in music, you want it to return to that comfortable, like tonic chord or whatever. But I think the powerful thing about the story is that what's satisfying is that they themselves recognize what they are to each other and how good that is, and therefore the sort of the confusion.
And finally, at Gold Derby, we cover awards all year long. So I want to ask about your Oscar nomination for Room a few years ago. Now, Room kind of came on at the very start of the season at the Toronto Film Festival, won that. And then we kind of didn't really see you again until the end when you got the Oscar nomination. But
Yeah,
obviously, it's very deserved. A lot of people voted for you. I'm wondering if that's something that, on the ground when you're going to all these events, like, could you tell that there were actually rumblings? Were you tipped off that you would be getting a
I
nomination?
well, funnily enough, I didn't think I would. I mean, I think we were all working, like we did a lot of travel and a lot of events and publicity, as everybody does when they've got a, if you're lucky enough to have a film in the conversation. But we were pushing really for Brie, for Best Film, and for Emma. We thought they were our really likely categories. I didn't think that I would get a nomination. I don't think anybody in the group or in A24 really thought that I would, because first time sort of being at that, you know, like it was a small film. There were some very, it's a very competitive category. We felt that all of the push we should make would be towards the one that was most likely to win, which was Brie. So we didn't really think that, and I knew how complicated and difficult it had been as a piece of work for me as a director, but I didn't think I would get nominated. And in fact, looking at like, I couldn't help but occasionally check Gold Derby, and see what are the rankings. And I sort of hovered around 8 or 9 mostly in people's predictions. So when it came to the announcement of the nominations, I was like back home in Dublin. I just come back from LA. I was a bit jet lagged, and watched it online through my laptop, and my wife was beside me, and we were thrilled when Brie got the nomination. And then it came to Best Director, and I was checking an email. I was interested to know. I really genuinely did not think it was going to happen. So it was an amazing surprise when it did. And it's been great. It really does open doors in ways, or at least makes it easier to talk to people. You don't sort of have to introduce yourself in the industry as much as you might have before that. But yeah, it was a big surprise, and I think I'd much rather be untipped and get nominated than be tipped and maybe not. That would be sort of, I think that would be more painful, or well, clearly more painful.
Yeah, well, Lenny, thanks so much for taking the time to chat. And to our viewers, you can check out other interviews with Emmy contenders on our YouTube channel and go to goldderby.com to make your own Emmy predictions.